We catfished a predator who was stalking my sister, but he ended up confessing to police. Leah showed me the 14th message at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, her hands shaking as she held her phone toward me in my apartment. The text said he knew what route she took home from work, knew she stopped at the coffee shop on Maple Street every morning at 7:15, knew she lived alone in the garden apartment with the blue door. Keith Donnelly had been messaging her for 6 weeks, ever since she'd politely declined his dinner invitation at a work conference in Denver. He was a regional sales director for a medical supply company, 43 years old, divorced, and apparently incapable of accepting rejection. The messages had started friendly, then persistent, then increasingly threatening as Leah continued ignoring them. This latest one crossed into territory that made my stomach clench with fear and rage. I asked if she'd reported him to the police, and Leah said she'd tried twice. The first officer had told her that unwanted messages weren't technically illegal unless they contained explicit threats. The second officer had been more sympathetic, but explained that without direct threats of violence, there was nothing they could do except suggest she block his number and stay aware of her surroundings. I looked at my younger sister sitting on my couch, 26 years old and terrified to walk to her own car, and something shifted in me. Leah had always been the careful one, the rule follower who colored inside the lines and trusted that systems worked if you followed proper procedures. She'd reported Keith through her company's HR department, blocked his number, documented every message he sent from new numbers, filed 2 police reports, and done everything she was supposed to do. None of it had stopped him. The messages kept coming from burner phones and anonymous email accounts. He'd started appearing places she frequented, always maintaining just enough distance to claim coincidence if confronted. Her company's HR had investigated and determined that since the initial contact happened at a conference rather than in the workplace, it was a personal matter outside their jurisdiction. They'd suggested she get a restraining order, which required evidence of imminent threat that she didn't legally have. The system was failing her systematically, and Keith knew it. I asked Leah what she wanted to happen, and she said she wanted him to stop. She wanted to feel safe going to work, buying groceries, existing in the world without constantly checking over her shoulder. She wanted to sleep without nightmares about him breaking into her apartment. Most of all, she wanted someone to make him understand that no meant no, that women weren't puzzles to be solved through persistence. I told her I had an idea that was probably illegal and definitely risky, but might actually work. Leah asked what kind of idea, and I explained we could catfish him. Create a fake online persona, make contact, get him to admit his stalking behavior, and potentially reveal if he'd done this to other women. Then we'd have concrete evidence for police and potentially his employer. Leah was quiet for a long moment before saying that felt like fighting dirty. I pointed out that Keith had already been fighting dirty for 6 weeks while we'd been trying to use proper channels. Maybe it was time to meet him where he lived, in the realm of deception and manipulation. My best friend Jenna was a cybersecurity analyst who owed me several favors after I'd helped her through a brutal divorce the previous year. I called her Saturday morning and explained the situation without mentioning any names or illegal activities. Jenna immediately understood what I was asking and said she could help create an untraceable online identity that would withstand scrutiny. She came over that afternoon with her laptop and a determined expression that suggested she'd dealt with predators before, either personally or professionally. We spent 4 hours constructing a persona named Sophie Chen. Wait, I can't use Chen. Sophie Brennan. 28 years old, marketing consultant, recently moved to our city from Portland, active on social media with carefully curated photos borrowed from a modeling portfolio website that had closed down years ago. Jenna explained that the key to successful catfishing was consistency and patience. We needed Sophie to have a complete digital footprint that seemed authentic, with connections to real people and realistic posting patterns going back months. Over the next week, Jenna built Sophie's online presence while I researched Keith Donnelly obsessively. His social media showed a carefully maintained image of successful professional who loved hiking, craft beer, and classic rock concerts. His LinkedIn described him as a results-driven leader who exceeded quarterly targets and mentored junior sales staff. His Facebook was filled with inspirational quotes about persistence and never giving up on your goals, which took on sinister meaning given his stalking behavior. I found his divorce records through public databases, showing his ex-wife Gina had filed for divorce 3 years ago, citing irreconcilable differences. I wanted to contact her to ask if Keith had displayed obsessive behavior during their marriage, but Jenna warned that any contact with his past connections could expose our operation. We needed to stay focused on gathering evidence about his current stalking of Leah, not building a comprehensive psychological profile. Although I suspected his ex-wife could tell us plenty about Keith's inability to respect boundaries. Sophie Brennan joined a professional networking group that Keith was active in, posting thoughtful comments about industry trends and supply chain logistics. Within 2 days, Keith sent her a connection request with a message complimenting her insights on healthcare technology adoption. Sophie waited 36 hours before accepting and responding with a brief thank you. Keith immediately sent another message suggesting they grab coffee to discuss potential business synergies. Sophie politely declined, saying she was focused on establishing her consulting practice and wasn't taking meetings yet. Keith responded that he understood and admired her dedication, but maybe she could make an exception for someone who could introduce her to key decision-makers in the regional healthcare market. The persistence was immediate and familiar. the same pressure he'd applied to Leah repackaged as professional networking. Sophie told him she'd think about it, keeping him engaged but not committed. Jenna explained this was the crucial phase, making Keith feel he was pursuing someone who might eventually say yes if he just tried hard enough. Meanwhile, Leah's situation was escalating. Keith had started leaving flowers outside her apartment door, always unsigned but obviously from him since they appeared after she'd ignored his latest messages. He'd sent her a gift card to the coffee shop she frequented with a note saying he'd noticed she always ordered the same drink and wanted to treat her. The note demonstrated he'd been watching her closely enough to know her routine order, which was both creepy and evidence of sustained stalking behavior. Leah called the police again with this new information, and the responding officer took a report, but said gift cards and flowers weren't threats. He suggested she install security cameras, which she couldn't afford on her administrative assistant salary. I offered to pay for cameras, but Leah refused, saying she was already imposing by asking me to run this catfishing operation. I pointed out that protecting my little sister wasn't an imposition, it was literally what big sisters did. But I understood her need to maintain some independence even while being victimized. Sophie's correspondence with Keith continued for 3 weeks, with Jenna carefully crafting responses that kept him interested, but never quite available. Keith's messages to Sophie were charming and professional on the surface, but contained the same underlying pressure visible in his messages to Leah. He'd suggest specific restaurants for their eventual meeting, then send links to reviews as if her agreement was inevitable. He'd mention conferences and networking events Sophie should attend, offering to introduce her to influential people. When Sophie said she was too busy, Keith would send encouraging messages about work-life balance and the importance of making time for meaningful connections. The subtext was always that Sophie's no really meant maybe, that her boundaries were obstacles to overcome rather than statements to respect. Jenna said this was classic predator behavior, treating consent as a negotiation rather than a requirement. Men who behave this way in digital spaces often escalated to physical stalking when their online manipulation failed. The breakthrough came when Sophie mentioned she was having trouble finding a good therapist in the city, a detail Jenna added to make her seem vulnerable and isolated. Keith immediately responded with a long message about how he'd struggled with the same issue after his divorce, how he understood the challenge of maintaining mental health while building a career in a new city. He said he'd found it helpful to talk to someone who understood, and would Sophie like to meet for dinner to discuss strategies for managing stress? Sophie agreed to meet him the following Friday at a restaurant downtown, a public place where Leah would never go, eliminating any chance Keith would recognize her. The plan was for me to attend the dinner as Sophie while Jenna monitored from her car, recording everything through a wire I'd wear under my clothing. We'd gather evidence of Keith admitting to stalking behavior, maybe get him to reveal if he'd targeted other women, and then turn everything over to police with documentation they couldn't ignore. I spent the week before the dinner studying Sophie's digital persona until I could recite her fake biography from memory. Portland native, moved for better career opportunities, parents retired in Arizona, no siblings, undergrad degree from University of Oregon, favorite food was Thai, allergic to shellfish, loved indie rock and true crime podcasts. Jenna drilled me on maintaining consistent body language and speech patterns that matched Sophie's professional but approachable online personality. She warned that Keith would be watching for inconsistencies, that men like him were often skilled at detecting deception because they practiced it constantly themselves. I needed to be Sophie completely, giving him no reason to suspect the woman across the table was connected to Leah in any way. The thought of sitting across from the man who'd been terrorizing my sister made my skin crawl, but I channeled that revulsion into determination. Keith was about to meet someone who wouldn't be intimidated or manipulated, who was gathering evidence for his destruction. Thursday night, 36 hours before the scheduled dinner, Leah called me at midnight crying. Keith had been waiting outside her apartment when she got home from a late shift, standing on the sidewalk in a way that wasn't technically trespassing but was clearly intentional. He'd approached her car as she parked and tried to talk to her through the closed window, saying he was worried about her, that he'd noticed she seemed stressed lately and wanted to help. Leah had stayed in her locked car and called 911, but by the time the police arrived 15 minutes later, Keith had left. The responding officers took a report and confirmed what we already knew. Standing on a public sidewalk wasn't illegal, attempting conversation wasn't assault, and unless Keith explicitly threatened violence, there was no basis for arrest or a restraining order. One officer suggested Leah might want to consider moving to a different apartment, as if being stalked was her problem to solve by rearranging her entire life. After they left, Leah had called me from inside her locked apartment, asking if she should come stay with me for a while, admitting she was terrified. I told Leah to pack a bag and come immediately, that she'd stay with me until this situation was resolved. While she drove over, I called Jenna and explained the escalation. Jenna said we needed to accelerate our timeline and spring the trap sooner rather than wait for Friday's dinner. If Keith was escalating to physical proximity with Leah, he might become violent before we could gather sufficient evidence. We revised the plan. Sophie would message Keith that evening saying she'd had an unexpected opening in her schedule and was wondering if he was free for drinks that night instead of waiting until Friday. Men with Keith's psychology couldn't resist immediate gratification, especially when it meant a woman was pursuing them instead of being pursued. Jenna predicted he'd drop everything to meet Sophie tonight, and she was right. Keith responded within 8 minutes, suggesting a wine bar near downtown that was upscale enough to impress but casual enough for spontaneous meeting. Sophie agreed to meet him at 9 o'clock, giving me 90 minutes to prepare. Leah arrived at my apartment and I explained the revised plan while she unpacked her overnight bag. She was terrified about me meeting Keith in person, worried he might somehow recognize me from photos on Leah's social media. I assured her my hair was different, I'd be wearing dramatic makeup, and Keith had never seen me in person since Leah and I deliberately didn't have photos together online for privacy reasons. Jenna arrived with her recording equipment and a shopping bag containing the outfit she'd selected for Sophie. Professional but approachable, attractive but not provocative, the kind of clothing that signaled success without desperation. She wired me with a small recording device disguised as a necklace pendant, testing the audio quality while explaining backup protocols if anything went wrong. If I said the safe word Portland in a sentence, Jenna would call police immediately. If I didn't check in via text within 20 minutes of leaving the bar, she'd assume emergency and notify authorities. Leah sat on my couch looking increasingly worried as we prepared, but didn't try to talk me out of it because we both understood this might be our only chance to stop Keith before his stalking escalated to violence. The wine bar was exactly the kind of place Keith would choose: dim lighting, intimate booths, extensive wine list, and subtle pretension. I arrived 5 minutes late to let Keith get there first, wanting him to be the one waiting and slightly anxious. He was sitting in a corner booth wearing business casual clothing and a cologne that probably cost more per ounce than my hourly wage, and he stood when he saw me approaching with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I introduced myself as Sophie and shook his hand, noting that his grip lasted a fraction too long and applied slightly too much pressure. These were dominant signals, subtle ways of establishing control in an interaction. I slid into the booth across from him rather than next to him, maintaining physical distance while Jenna's recording device captured everything. Keith ordered an expensive bottle of wine without asking my preference, another control move disguised as generosity. He asked about my week and I recited Sophie's fictional consulting projects, watching him nod along without really listening because he was already strategizing his next move. Keith dominated the conversation for the first 30 minutes, talking about his career achievements, his divorce presented as his ex-wife's failure to appreciate his dedication to success, his expensive hobbies, and his philosophy that life rewarded those who refused to take no for an answer. That last part made my teeth clench, but I maintained Sophie's pleasant expression, asking follow-up questions and appearing impressed by his accomplishments. He asked about my relationship history, and I said I'd recently ended a long-term relationship, making Sophie seem available and potentially vulnerable. Keith leaned forward, his body language becoming more intimate as he said breakups were opportunities for growth, that sometimes people didn't realize what they wanted until they met someone who showed them new possibilities. I asked what he meant by that, and Keith launched into a story about a woman he'd recently met who initially wasn't interested, but whom he was confident would come around once she understood how committed he was to making her happy. The way he described his pursuit of this unnamed woman was chilling, referring to her resistance as playing hard to get and her explicit rejections as tests of his persistence. At that, I asked how this woman had communicated her lack of interest, and Keith said she'd blocked his number, which he described as dramatic and unnecessary. He'd simply found other ways to contact her because he believed their connection was too strong to let minor obstacles prevent its natural development. I felt rage building in my chest but kept my voice casual as I asked if maybe the woman genuinely wasn't interested, and he should respect that. Keith's expression hardened slightly as he explained that women often didn't know what they really wanted, that society had taught them to play games and pretend disinterest to avoid seeming desperate. He said a real man understood this and persisted until the woman felt safe enough to admit her true feelings. I pointed out that sounded somewhat manipulative, and Keith laughed, saying Sophie was refreshingly direct but clearly hadn't experienced the kind of connection he was describing. He asked if I'd ever had someone pursue me intensely despite my initial resistance, and had I eventually appreciated their dedication? I said no, that when I told someone I wasn't interested, I meant it and expected that boundary to be respected. Keith looked at me appraisingly and said maybe I'd just never met someone willing to fight for me properly. The conversation continued for another hour with Keith revealing increasingly disturbing beliefs about relationships, consent, and women's autonomy. He described several situations where he'd pursued women who'd explicitly rejected him, always framing his behavior as romantic persistence rather than harassment. He mentioned installing a tracking app on his ex-wife's phone during their divorce because he'd been concerned about her safety, not acknowledging that monitoring someone's location without consent was stalking regardless of stated intentions. He talked about a coworker who'd filed a complaint about his attention, describing her as oversensitive and saying HR had overreacted to innocent flirting. Each story revealed a pattern of boundary violations justified through elaborate rationalizations that positioned Keith as misunderstood rather than predatory. I asked if he'd ever considered that his behavior might genuinely frighten these women, and Keith said fear was sometimes part of attraction, that intensity could be mistaken for threat by people who hadn't learned to embrace passionate connection. At that point, I decided to push harder. I told Keith I'd been honest with him and expected the same courtesy, so I wanted to know if he was currently pursuing someone despite her clearly stated disinterest. Keith hesitated before saying yes, There was someone he'd met recently who was being stubborn about acknowledging their compatibility. I asked what methods he was using to pursue her, and Keith's eyes lit up with an eagerness that made my stomach turn. He described following her daily routine to learn her preferences, sending gifts to demonstrate his attention, appearing in places she frequented to create opportunities for natural interaction. He said he'd been documenting everything about her because he wanted to understand her completely, so he could prove how perfect they'd be together. I asked if this woman knew he was following her, and Keith said she knew he was interested, which wasn't the same thing as knowing he'd been stalking her systematically for weeks. I pointed out that following someone and documenting their routine without consent sounded illegal, and Keith's expression shifted from excited to defensive. He said I was being judgmental about behavior I didn't understand, that what he was doing was no different from how people had courted each other for centuries before dating apps and hookup culture ruined authentic connection. I asked if he'd considered that authentic connection required mutual interest, and Keith said mutual interest developed over time when one person demonstrated sufficient dedication. I pushed further, asking if he'd ever done anything that crossed legal lines in his pursuit of women. Keith leaned back in the booth, studying me with an intensity that felt threatening, and asked why I was suddenly so interested in the legality of his romantic strategies. I said I worked in consulting and was naturally curious about risk assessment, that his approach seemed to carry significant personal and professional risk if the women he pursued decided to involve authorities. Keith relaxed slightly and said he'd been careful, that he understood how to maintain plausible deniability, how to ensure his actions couldn't be proven as harassment even if they were reported. That admission was exactly what I needed recorded. I asked him to elaborate on his risk management strategies, and Keith, apparently comfortable now that he thought we were bonding over shared amorality, explained in detail how he used burner phones to avoid documentation, how he maintained distance in public spaces to prevent trespassing charges, how he framed his communications as concerned friendship rather than harassment. He described consulting with lawyers to understand exactly where legal lines were drawn so he could operate just inside those boundaries. He said the key was making the target feel watched and powerless without giving authorities concrete evidence for intervention. I asked if he ever worried about the psychological impact on these women, and Keith said that if they truly weren't interested, they'd move to different cities or change their routines completely. The fact that they stayed in their homes and jobs meant they were subconsciously inviting his continued attention. His logic was sociopathic, completely void of empathy or recognition that women shouldn't have to upend their lives to escape unwanted attention. I excused myself to the bathroom, needing a moment to compose myself before I said something that would blow my cover. In the restaurant bathroom, I sent Jenna a coded text indicating we had good evidence and I wanted to exit soon. She responded that the recording quality was excellent and I should try to get Keith to name his current target explicitly. Back at the table, Keith had ordered another bottle of wine without asking and seemed more relaxed, apparently interpreting my bathroom break as normal rather than strategic retreat. I asked directly who his current target was and whether he'd made real progress in winning her over. Keith said her name was Leah and she worked in medical administration, that they'd met at a conference and he'd immediately recognized their connection despite her initial shyness. He described Leah's appearance, her apartment building, her daily routine, and her resistance to his attention with a mixture of frustration and obsessive fascination that confirmed every fear I'd had about the danger he posed. He said he was confident she'd come around soon, that he was planning a grand gesture that would make her understand how serious he was about building a life together. I asked what kind of grand gesture, and Keith's expression became calculating. He said he'd been considering showing up at her workplace with flowers and a public declaration, or maybe surprising her at her apartment with dinner and music to create a romantic atmosphere she couldn't resist. I pointed out that surprising someone at their home uninvited was breaking and entering, and Keith said only if she called the police before he could explain his intentions. He believed Leah would be too shocked to react immediately, giving him time to present his case and convince her to give him a chance. The casual way he described planning to invade her home and corner her physically made me want to reach across the table and hurt him, but I maintained Sophie's facade while my mind raced through implications. Keith was planning to escalate beyond stalking to actual home invasion, possibly within days. We needed to act immediately, not wait for police to slowly process evidence and decide whether it met their thresholds for intervention. I told Keith I needed to leave because I had an early client meeting, deflecting his attempts to extend the evening or make plans for another meeting. He walked me to my car despite my protests, standing too close as I unlocked the door and saying he'd enjoyed our conversation, that Sophie was different from other women he'd met recently because I understood the importance of going after what you wanted. He asked if I'd like to continue our discussion somewhere more private, and I said maybe another time, maintaining Sophie's persona long enough to get in my car and leave. Keith stood in the parking lot watching me drive away, and I could see him in my rearview mirror pulling out his phone immediately. I drove to the predetermined meeting point where Jenna was waiting in her car, and the moment I got in, we called Leah to explain what had happened. She answered crying, saying Keith had just sent her a message saying he'd had an interesting evening meeting someone new who'd helped him clarify his feelings. He said he was done being patient and was going to show Leah definitively how much she meant to him, that she should expect to see him soon. At that, Jenna and I drove straight to the police station with the recording equipment and transcripts of everything Keith had said. We arrived at 11:30 at night and demanded to speak to someone in the detective division about an active stalking case with imminent threat. The desk officer was skeptical until I explained that a man had just confessed to planning a home invasion, and we had audio evidence of explicit stalking admission. Detective Angela Frost was working late and agreed to meet with us, listening to the recording with increasing concern as Keith described his systematic stalking of Leah and his planned escalation. When the recording finished, Detective Frost asked how we'd obtained it, and I explained the catfishing operation in detail, acknowledging we'd potentially broken laws ourselves, but arguing the evidence was too important to dismiss on procedural grounds. Detective Frost was quiet for a long moment before saying that while our methods were problematic and could complicate prosecution, Keith's recorded confession provided probable cause for immediate intervention. She asked if we had any of Keith's communications to Leah, and I pulled up the dozens of messages on my phone where I'd had Leah forward everything he'd sent. Detective Frost called in 2 other officers, and they began building a case file while Jenna and I waited in the station. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Detective Frost returned and said they had enough evidence to obtain a warrant for Keith's arrest on stalking charges and probable cause to search his home and electronic devices. She said our recording wouldn't be admissible in court due to how it was obtained, but it had given them direction for official investigation and probable cause for arrest. They'd picked up Keith at his apartment 20 minutes ago and were currently interviewing him. He'd initially denied everything, but when confronted with evidence from Leah's documented messages and witness statements from neighbors who'd seen him outside her building, he'd requested an attorney. Detective Frost said Keith would be held overnight and arraigned in the morning, and she'd recommend high bail given the home invasion planning we'd recorded. She also said we'd been incredibly lucky that Keith hadn't recognized me or hurt me during our meeting, and that catfishing suspects was dangerous and illegal vigilante activity that could have ended very differently. I accepted the criticism because it was valid, but pointed out that official channels had failed Leah completely until we forced action through unconventional means. I went home at 4 o'clock in the morning to find Leah still awake, unable to sleep knowing Keith had been planning to invade her apartment. I told her Keith was in custody and she started crying from relief and exhaustion, saying she'd been terrified for so long that she'd forgotten what safety felt like. We stayed up the rest of the night talking while Jenna slept on my couch, processing the evening's events and trying to understand how the system could fail so completely that victims had to resort to entrapment operations to protect themselves. Leah said she felt guilty that I'd put myself at risk meeting Keith, and guilty that someone else might be his next victim if he was eventually released. I reminded her that Keith's behavior was his responsibility alone, not hers, and that we'd done everything possible to ensure he faced consequences. Detective Frost called at 8 o'clock in the morning saying Keith had been arraigned and bail was set at $50,000, which his family had immediately posted. He was being released with a restraining order prohibiting contact with Leah and electronic monitoring pending trial. The trial date was set for 3 months away. The relief of Keith's arrest lasted exactly 4 days before everything fell apart. Detective Frost called Wednesday morning saying Keith's attorney had filed a motion to dismiss all charges based on entrapment, arguing that Keith had been illegally recorded without consent and manipulated into making statements he never would have made to law enforcement. The attorney claimed the entire catfishing operation constituted police misconduct since we'd worked directly with Detective Frost after obtaining the recording. The district attorney was reviewing the case and would decide whether to proceed with prosecution or drop charges due to tainted evidence. Furthermore, Keith's attorney had filed a civil lawsuit against me personally for fraud, emotional distress, and defamation, claiming my impersonation of Sophie Brennan had been a malicious scheme to destroy his reputation and career. The lawsuit sought $500,000 in damages and included a countersuit restraining order prohibiting me from contacting Keith or discussing the case publicly. I called Jenna in panic and she said we'd anticipated this possibility, that Keith's legal maneuvering was predictable but didn't change the fundamental truth of his stalking behavior. Leah was devastated when I explained the situation, blaming herself for the legal nightmare I was now facing. She offered to testify about Keith's stalking and drop her complaints if it would protect me from the lawsuit. I refused absolutely, explaining that Keith was using legal intimidation to silence victims and observers, a classic abuser tactic that worked only if people backed down. We needed to fight harder and smarter, document everything, and find ways to expose Keith's pattern of predatory behavior that wouldn't rely on the inadmissible recording. Jenna suggested we investigate Keith's past more thoroughly, finding other women he'd stalked or harassed who might be willing to testify. If we could demonstrate a pattern of behavior, the prosecution could proceed even without our recording being admissible. Detective Frost agreed this was the best strategy and said her investigation had already identified 2 other women who'd filed reports about Keith in the past 18 months, though neither had pursued charges. She'd reach out to them about participating in the current case. The next week was consumed by legal meetings and investigation coordination. I hired an attorney to defend against Keith's civil lawsuit, using savings I'd been accumulating for a down payment on a house. My attorney, Nicole Sherman, explained that Keith's lawsuit was largely frivolous but would still require time and money to defeat, which was exactly Keith's intention. He wanted to punish me financially and emotionally for interfering with his stalking of Leah. Nicole filed a countersuit arguing that Keith's lawsuit constituted legal harassment designed to silence witness testimony in a criminal case, and requested the judge consolidate the civil and criminal proceedings to prevent Keith from using one to manipulate the other. Meanwhile, Detective Frost located the 2 previous complainants against Keith. The first was a coworker from his previous company who'd left her job after Keith wouldn't accept her rejection of his advances. The second was a woman he'd met at a gym who'd changed gyms and eventually moved to a different city after Keith's attention became threatening. Both women agreed to provide testimony but were terrified of retaliation, which Detective Frost said was common in stalking cases because the justice system provided inadequate protection for victims who came forward. Keith's trial was postponed twice due to his attorney's procedural challenges and motions, dragging the case out for 8 months. During this time, Leah lived with me because she was too frightened to return to her apartment even though Keith was prohibited from contact. She'd taken a leave of absence from her job after Keith's attorney subpoenaed her employment records and began calling her coworkers as potential witnesses to his supposed professional relationship with her. The harassment was legal and systematic, designed to make her too exhausted and intimidated to testify. Keith's attorney was a specialist in defending men accused of harassment and stalking, known for aggressive tactics that re-traumatized victims during depositions and trial testimony. Nicole warned me that if the case went to trial, Keith's attorney would attempt to paint me as an unhinged vigilante who'd fabricated evidence out of irrational overprotectiveness toward my sister. He'd argue Sophie Brennan was a honey trap designed to entrap an innocent man whose only crime was persistent romantic interest. The trial strategy would be attacking the victim and anyone who'd tried to help her rather than defending Keith's documented behavior. 2 weeks before the scheduled trial, something unexpected happened. Detective Frost called and asked me to come to the station immediately, saying there'd been a significant development but she couldn't discuss it over the phone. I arrived within 30 minutes to find her meeting room occupied by Keith, his attorney, a district attorney prosecutor, and a court stenographer. Detective Frost explained that Keith had requested this meeting to make a statement, and his attorney had agreed on the condition that certain immunity provisions were negotiated. I was confused and alarmed, wondering if Keith was about to admit something that would make the prosecution stronger, or if this was another legal maneuver. The district attorney explained that Keith had information about other cases unrelated to Leah's situation, and in exchange for providing that information, he was willing to plead guilty to stalking charges with reduced sentencing recommendations. Keith's attorney clarified that his client wanted to clear his conscience about matters that had been weighing on him since his arrest. What followed was 90 minutes of confession that left everyone in the room stunned. Keith admitted to stalking Leah exactly as we'd documented, acknowledging every behavior we'd recorded and many we hadn't discovered. He described installing a GPS tracker on her car, hacking her social media accounts to read her private messages, and photographing her through her apartment windows on multiple occasions. He admitted to stalking 4 other women over the previous 6 years, providing names, dates, and detailed descriptions of his surveillance activities. 2 of these women had no idea they'd been targeted because Keith's stalking had been so sophisticated they'd never detected it. He confessed to breaking into one woman's apartment to install cameras in her bedroom and bathroom, recording her for 3 months before she'd accidentally discovered the equipment. He described manipulating another woman's work computer to access her personal files and emails. Every confession was detailed and specific, provided with an eeriness that suggested relief at finally unburdening himself. His attorney sat silently throughout, and I realized this wasn't a negotiated immunity deal, but something else entirely, something Keith needed to do regardless of legal consequences. When Keith finished, the district attorney asked why he was confessing to crimes that could result in decades of prison time when he'd been fighting the charges for months. Keith looked directly at me for the first time since I'd entered the room and said meeting Sophie had broken something in him. He said I'd represented everything he thought women should be: intelligent, successful, independent, and seemingly interested in him. But during our conversation when I'd challenged his behavior and called it what it actually was, harassment and stalking, he'd felt something shift in his understanding of himself. He said he'd spent the night after our meeting unable to sleep, replaying every interaction he'd had with women over the years, and recognizing a pattern he'd been deliberately blind to. He said his arrest had forced him into therapy as a condition of bail, and his therapist had helped him understand that his behavior wasn't romantic persistence, but pathological need for control stemming from childhood trauma and narcissistic personality disorder. He said he'd spent 8 months in intensive therapy confronting the harm he'd caused and accepting that he'd been a predator who justified his predation through elaborate self-deception. Keith said he wasn't seeking forgiveness or sympathy, just accepting responsibility for his actions and their consequences. He acknowledged that his victims deserved justice and that imprisonment was appropriate punishment for what he'd done. He said the worst part of his confession was recognizing how many women he'd traumatized while believing he was expressing love, how completely he'd prioritized his desires over their autonomy and safety. His attorney confirmed this confession had been Keith's idea, not a strategic legal maneuver, and that Keith was prepared to accept whatever sentence the court imposed. The district attorney said this was highly unusual, but that Keith's cooperation and confession would be taken into account during sentencing. He'd be pleading guilty to 8 felony stalking charges, 2 counts of breaking and entering, unauthorized surveillance, and computer crimes. The recommended sentence would be 12 years with possibility of parole after 8, plus mandatory psychological treatment and lifetime registration as a sex offender. Keith agreed to these terms without negotiation. I sat in that meeting room trying to process what had just happened. The man who'd terrorized my sister for months, who'd planned to invade her home and corner her physically, who'd stalked multiple women with sociopathic precision, was confessing everything and accepting consequences because one conversation with a fake person had cracked his psychological armor. It felt surreal and insufficient, a redemption arc that glossed over the trauma he'd inflicted. But it was also more accountability than most stalking victims ever received, a complete admission of guilt that validated every fear and concern. Detective Frost asked if I had questions for Keith, and I asked if he understood the lasting damage he'd caused, if he comprehended that Leah would spend years recovering from his stalking, that the other women he'd targeted would never feel completely safe again. Keith said he was beginning to understand, but knew his understanding was incomplete because he hadn't experienced the terror himself. He said that was why he'd decided to confess, because the only thing he could offer his victims was complete honesty and acceptance of punishment, inadequate as that was. The formal plea agreement was finalized the following week. Keith pleaded guilty to all charges in open court, reading a statement that acknowledged specific harm to each victim and accepted responsibility without excuses. Leah attended the hearing and gave a victim impact statement describing the psychological toll of his stalking, the fear that had consumed her life, and the ongoing anxiety that persisted even after his arrest. The other victims gave statements as well, describing years of trauma and ongoing hypervigilance that had affected their careers, relationships, and mental health. The judge accepted the plea agreement and sentenced Keith to 12 years in state prison, noting that while his confession and acceptance of responsibility were mitigating factors, the systematic and predatory nature of his crimes warranted substantial punishment. Keith was remanded to custody immediately. As they led him from the courtroom, he looked at Leah and said he was sorry, not expecting forgiveness but wanting her to know his remorse was genuine. Leah said nothing, just watched him disappear through the bailiff's door. The civil lawsuit Keith had filed against me was dismissed with prejudice after his criminal conviction, his attorney withdrawing all claims. My legal fees had consumed $23,000 of my savings, but I'd avoided the $500,000 judgment Keith had sought. Leah returned to her apartment after having the locks changed and installing the security system I'd paid for. She'd started therapy to process the trauma of Keith's stalking and was slowly rebuilding her sense of safety. She'd returned to work but requested a transfer to a different location to avoid reminders of the conference where she'd met Keith. The other victims Keith had confessed to stalking received validation and closure they'd never expected, though several said the confession raised new trauma about violations they hadn't previously known about. Detective Frost said Keith's case had prompted her department to revise their stalking response protocols, implementing earlier intervention procedures and taking initial complaints more seriously. Small victories in a system that still fundamentally failed to protect victims adequately. Jenna and I remained close friends, bonded by the intense experience of the catfishing operation and its aftermath. She said she'd been researching Sophie Brennan's social media presence and had discovered dozens of other men who'd sent Sophie connection requests or messages after Keith's arrest, several using language similar to Keith's persistent boundary pushing. She said predatory men seemed to recognize and target women who appeared isolated or new to an area, viewing them as vulnerable opportunities rather than autonomous people. She'd kept Sophie's profile active as a research project, documenting approaches and patterns that might help identify predatory behavior. I told her that felt risky, but understood the impulse to use what we'd learned to protect others. Nicole Sherman, my attorney, had suggested writing about the experience to raise awareness about stalking victims' lack of legal protection and the desperate measures they sometimes employed for safety. She connected me with a journalist who specialized in criminal justice issues, and I gave an interview describing the entire situation while protecting victims' identities. The article was published 6 months after Keith's sentencing and generated significant discussion about stalking laws and victim protection. Several legislators cited the article when proposing reforms to make stalking easier to prosecute and provide better resources for victims. Keith's case became reference point in legal education about the gap between behavior that felt threatening and behavior that met legal thresholds for intervention. His therapy-prompted confession was studied as an unusual example of offender accountability. Mental health professionals debated whether his apparent remorse was genuine or another form of manipulation. His ex-wife Gina reached out to Leah after the article was published, apologizing for not warning other women about Keith's controlling behavior during their marriage. She said she'd been too ashamed and frightened to speak publicly, but wanted Leah and the other victims to know they'd done nothing to provoke Keith's stalking, that his behavior was pathological and would have found targets regardless of how careful women were about their interactions with him. 3 years after Keith's imprisonment, Leah had rebuilt her life and was in a healthy relationship with someone who respected boundaries instinctively. She still experienced anxiety in certain situations, but had developed coping strategies through therapy. She'd become an advocate for stalking victims, volunteering with organizations that provided support and legal assistance. She said surviving Keith's stalking and seeing him held accountable had given her life unexpected purpose. Keith remained imprisoned, reportedly participating in intensive therapy and correspondence programs with other offenders working on understanding their harmful behaviors. I didn't know if his remorse was genuine or performative, if therapy had truly changed him, or if he'd simply become more sophisticated in his self-justifications. What mattered was that he was incarcerated, unable to harm anyone, and his victims had received validation that their fear had been rational and their experiences real. The catfishing operation had been risky and legally questionable, but it had forced accountability that the justice system had been unwilling or unable to provide through conventional means. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.